webinar series. And as you can tell, this meeting will be recorded. I am Christelle Guédot. I'm the fruit crop entomologist and extension specialist at UW-Madison. And as you all should know by now, we are putting this webinar series together with a collaboration from different universities: University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Minnesota, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign Extension, and Iowa State University. And so we're very happy to host you all. Today, we're going to have one of our organizers give a presentation here. And her name is Dr. Kacie Athey from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And she will be talking to us about pest management with trapping and monitoring. So if we could have the next slide, this is the presentation that Kacie will be putting together for you today. I would like to first introduce Dr. Athey, who is the specialty crops extension entomologist at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her research focuses on non-chemical control of insect pests in vegetable and fruit production. Her current projects are exploring biological control in high tunnels and cultural control in tomato and cucumber production. In addition to her research and extension duties, she team teaches 2 classes in the crop science department at the University of Illinois. Before we get started, I would like to make sure that everybody keeps themselves muted during this presentation. We will take all the questions at the end. We will have a poll before the Q&A session. So if you want along the presentation, feel free to type your questions in the chat, and I will read them at the end of the presentation, right after the poll session. And besides that, I think it will run like any other webinar, and I will turn it over to Kacie.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. I think, at least try to. Let's see.
Is that going?
There we go.
It worked a minute ago.
Found it. Yep.
It should work again. There we go.
Took me a second to find it.
Okay, thank you, Kacie. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think today I'm going to talk about kind of a variety of things, but you know, for new apple growers, I think there's a lot to take into account. There's a lot to learn. And so as far as insect pest management goes, of course, that stands true here as well. And today what I'm going to do is kind of start with a description of best practices for pest control. So if you've done any kind of growing before, of course, you'll probably be aware of some of this, but I think it's important to go into. And then I'm going to talk about trapping, of course, and some control techniques, but then I am going to actually talk about a few of the pests that you'll encounter in Midwest apple orchards and things that when you're just starting out that you need to be really aware of. And of course, this won't encompass all of them, but you know, we'll get to those here in a few minutes. So I'm going to start with a large definition here. And I think it's important to point this out. We as extension folks and people who work in sort of insect control always advocate for integrated pest management, or IPM. And there's a lot going on here in this definition, of course, that you can read here. But really what it is we're basing our control tactics, we want them to be sustainable. We want them to be based on science and on insect life cycles. And it's a combination of strategies. So it's not just spraying insecticides to deal with your pest issues, although of course, that's going to be a big part of it often. The other bit about IPM that's really important is that it does take into account minimizing economic risk as well. and health risks and environmental risks. So it's sort of a holistic approach to pest control. And so we use this as a framework when we talk about pest control, when we talk about, how we deal with these things in basically every system. But of course, today I'll be focusing on apple production. And it's important to note here that the purpose of pest control is not just to kill all possible pests. Sometimes we can tolerate some level of pest in our orchards and not actually have to control for them, provided they stay below a certain threshold. And so a lot of IPM is working to decrease the impact of pests, not just kill every bug in sight, essentially. So IPM, that's the concept there that I just talked about, and IPM strategies actually follow a specific set of steps. And IPM tends to be a more targeted approach than just taking a broad spectrum insecticide and spraying it on a calendar basis. And so, as the title of this suggests, something that's very important here is the monitoring and identification of the actual pests we need to be worried about. And that is the first step of IPM, is monitoring for pests and then identifying the pests we have in the system. And so we need to know which ones we need to control in the first place. And so what I have here on the right is something that once you start apple production, you'll become quite familiar with, called the Delta trap. And the Delta trap is the most common, I would say, insect trapping method that we use in orchard systems. It's often very specialized. And so when you're trapping, you're putting out your traps. Once you catch an insect, of course, you have to identify it. And the nice thing about using Delta traps is we often use lures that bring in only basically one type of insect. So as a grower, you're able to identify your insect problem that way. I'll talk a little bit more about the trapping here in just a few minutes. But once you've identified the pests, then we have these action thresholds that, as I talk about pests, I'll talk about what some of the actual action thresholds are. And that is kind of the number of pests that you catch over a given time or in a certain area that tells you that you, in fact, actually do need to take some sort of control. If the number of pests is below that, you don't have to do anything. And so that is absolutely pest dependent. And one thing to note is that when you're doing your control earlier in the season, for control is always better. You want to start your monitoring as early as you can and your control as soon as it's needed. Of course, the next step after you have established this threshold is actually doing control. And again, I'll talk about a fair amount of that here today as well. I wanted to highlight that what I'll talk about in apple systems is, of course, insecticides. I'll talk about mating disruption, and then I'll also talk about sanitation as sort of the things that we put together to do this control. And then the last step is to evaluate effectiveness. And the most common way that we do this is yield or damage to fruit. So you can, of course, continue to monitor. And one of the ways you can evaluate the effectiveness is, of course, if the next year you have fewer pests, you may have been effective at, knocking down those populations the year before. And so these are the steps of IPM that we use when doing, any kind of pest management. And so, I'm going to talk about these things, the monitoring and identification. And I want to note that generally speaking, the two ways that we do monitoring is through actual field scouting and then use of traps, at least in orchards. And I just want to note that for many pests, the action threshold is based on using a specific type of trap that I'll talk about here in a second. And so often, if you're not using those traps, you won't really be able to establish the action threshold for a given pest in an IPM framework. So gonna kind of move into this topic. This is very important in trapping. And I just want to put some context with it. So most of our insect traps in orchards use, or a lot of them use, pheromones. And if you have not heard of pheromones before, all that this is just chemicals that are used to communicate between individuals of the same species. And there are lots of types of pheromones for the purposes of orchard monitoring and some of our control techniques. The type that we use are sex pheromones. So we use these for a lot of insect monitoring and lures, and we use it for mating disruption, which I'll talk about briefly as well. You don't really need to worry about the other types, but I did want to mention that there are other types of pheromones that we do use in insect monitoring as well. But generally speaking, you're using the sex pheromones. And there are, last time that I looked this up, there's about 155 registered pheromone products out there. So there's a lot of pests we can monitor this way. So as far as orchard pests go, there are lots of commercially available pheromones out there, and they're not just for orchard pests, but of course, if you're beginning apple production, that's what you're going to be concerned about. And we have a lot of these are used for monitoring and mating disruption. So some of the pests I have here today, I will talk about a bit, some I won't. So I just wanted to point out that you have things like Japanese beetles, oriental fruit moth, plum curculio, codling moth, brown marmorated stink bugs, which is actually an aggregation pheromone, and then peach tree borers, which are all things that orchard workers have to, orchard producers have to worry about. And of course, like I said, there's a bunch of other ones available as well for lures. So there are two things that we use for this. Insect monitoring is going to be the most common one, of course. And I just wanted to show you different trapping types that use these pheromone lures and sort of the, ubiquity of these throughout IPM in an orchard. So on the left, you'll see a delta trap. Delta traps, again, by far the most common thing that we use in orchard systems. And they are used for monitoring a variety of things. The most important one, I would say, probably is codling moth, and I'll talk pretty extensively about codling moth today. And they're hung in the upper third of the tree canopy, and it's an orange trap with a sticky liner to catch the things that are lured into the trap. And then they also have the pheromone lure there. When you're doing trapping and monitoring, generally speaking, for most pheromone lures, that has a 6-week shelf life, essentially. So you'll have those lures in your traps for about 6 weeks, and then you'll have to change them out. We recommend, when using these types of traps, that you're checking them weekly. And generally speaking, that's good practice for any of these trapping, is to make sure that you're checking them weekly. Often our economic thresholds have a number of pests per trap per week as the threshold. And so that's a good amount of time to go in between checking your traps. So the one in the middle is actually a stink bug trap. So that's another way that we do insect monitoring. And you can see the lure is the black part on that. And so that's just a sticky trap that the stink bugs get stuck on. And then on the right, I have a pyramid trap, which I'll talk a little bit about. They can be used for stink bugs and plum curculio. And all of these are commercially available for you to purchase through a variety of companies. And when you're looking to do trapping, often we have recommendations for, or the companies that sell them will have recommendations for how, where to put the traps, so how many you need per how many acres to do your insect monitoring correctly. And so it will vary depending on what you're monitoring and what type of trap you're using. So I did want to mention that the other thing that pheromones are used for in apple production is something called mating disruption. So as you start your journey in apple production, I would recommend looking into mating disruption, especially for things like codling moth. So mating disruption is a technique that prevents male insects from finding a female and mating. And this can delay or prevent egg laying. And we use sex pheromones to do this. So mating disruption, basically what happens is normally you have a female moth and your female moth is putting off a plume of sex pheromone that allows the male moth to find her. In mating disruption, you hang up all these emitters around the orchard and it floods the orchard with sex pheromone, so the male can't find the female. And so he's unable to mate with her, thus lowering the number of codling moth eggs that end up, or any other pest that this is used for, eggs that end up in your orchard. And now, as a beginning apple grower, depending on how large your orchard is, there's something to keep in mind about this type of a technique. It is for orchards that are a bit larger. A lot of the labels on these will say 5 acres or more, but really you're wanting, the 10 acres or more on here. And it does matter. So here, bigger is always better as far as your acreage goes, and your distance. When I say from source of a pest, means if you have a neighbor that has high pest pressure or an abandoned orchard near you, mating disruption may be harder to use. And it is a tactic for keeping pest pressure low. So when you're first starting out or first starting to use this now, as new apple producers, you may be able to use this in the beginning and have, still have to use some insecticides, but less if you don't have any, sort of pest pressure to start with. But if your pest pressure is high to begin with, you will have other control measures you absolutely will have to do. But the nice thing about mating disruption is it's very specific. It's specific to a given pest. It has no side effects against anything else. It's soft on natural enemies. It has no environmental effects. So it's a fantastic control measure to use. And you can absolutely use it in addition to any of the other controls that you might be using in an orchard. So in the Midwest, generally speaking, we have mating disruption available for these fruit tree pests. Now, of course, I'm including peach tree borers, which are peach pests, and oriental fruit moth is an apple pest, but it is worse in peaches. But just to give you an idea of, there are products available for mating disruption for these pests across, the Midwestern states. And one of the other reasons we use this control technique as opposed to just insecticide use is because all of these pests have larvae that are either inside of the fruit or inside of the trunk of the tree, and they're really hard to control with insecticide sprays. So if you can use something like this, your timings don't have to be perfect because you just hang them and leave the mating disruption up all year. And you were able to control these pests without having to, really be concentrating on timing as well. It is also should be mentioned that, of course, mating disruption is labeled for organic production as well as used in conventional production. Within the state of Washington, which of course produces lots and lots of apples, about 97% of the growers in that state, conventional and organic, use codling moth mating disruption every single year. So it is a commonly used technique. So even if you're using mating disruption, we always recommend monitoring, always back to the monitoring here. And I think it's important to mention this again. So with mating disruption, you're still using these delta traps. And in the case of a lot of the things we use for mating disruption, we recommend at least 1 per 10 acres. If you can do more, it's always good to do a few more. And then it should be noted here that your lure and mating disruption actually just contains the same sex pheromone. It's just that when we're using mating disruption, we're putting a lot more of it out. So when we're monitoring for codling moth, which is going to be the thing that, you're really going to be concentrating on, they actually make a lure that you'll still be able to catch codling moths in those traps. Because of course, if your lure is at the same concentration of your mating disruption, if your moth can't find the female, he can't find the trap either. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't monitor, because even when you're using mating disruption, if you're putting out your traps and you're collecting moths, that is a good indication that you're going to be needing to make those supplemental sprays, because your mating disruption isn't entirely shutting down the male's ability to find the female moths and mate. So with that context on there, I want to sort of move into some of the specific pests that you would be contending with when you start in apple production. Within the conversations about these specific pests, I will mention, some of the monitoring. I will mention some of the other, I'll mention where mating disruption comes in. And then I will also talk about insecticides, of course, that you can use for these things. Now, I want to mention that we have a Midwestern tree fruit management guide that you can always use. It's published through Purdue. I have a link to it at the very end of this talk, and that will give you a larger look at the pests that you'll be contending with in apples and the control measures that you can take, as well as some of the timings. So, is a long list of pests you might contend with when growing apples in the Midwest. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I've just picked a few. That's not meant to suggest that I picked the worst ones aside from codling moth, but I'll just, talk about a few of these, but all of these may be things you contend with as you start your journey. But I have to start with codling moth. We always have to start with codling moth, because codling moth is, and I mentioned pear here, although we don't grow very many pears, in the Midwest, but this is the most damaging pest of apples, basically worldwide. And it's something that anywhere we grow apples, growers are going to be contending with. There are at least 2 generations per year. So you are having to worry about spraying for these things more than once a year. And the reason that this is such a problem is because once that caterpillar gets inside the fruit is a cull. It's done. And so then there's no way to control it once it gets inside of there. So it's kind of a hard pest to deal with. And when people mention the worm in the apple, this is what they're talking about. You can see the pictures of the damage here on the fruit. So we have something called a sting, where the caterpillar tried to get inside, but maybe wasn't able to. And then we have something called an entry. And an entry is the evidence that there is a caterpillar inside of that apple. And you can often, if you look at that top left or top right photo, you see the caterpillar there, but if you look beyond that, you can see that sort of sawdusty looking stuff is actually the caterpillar poop. And you can often see that on the outside as well. So that can give you an idea of sort of the pressure of codling moths that you have in your orchard just by looking at your fruit. And just a little bit about, sort of their life cycle, you can see here on this slide. They are flying in late April or early May, so control has to happen pretty quickly early in the season. And those moth numbers can increase a lot each generation. And so that means your infestation can get out of control pretty quickly if you don't do anything about it, if it's left unchecked. And so we have, for this pest, sort of come up with, a pest control toolbox, if you will, where we're really trying to target that first generation, really get that population down. And we have 3 things that we recommend that people use for this pest. So we recommend mating disruption, and then sort of spray targets that will target either the eggs first or followed by those first hatched caterpillars. Because like I said, once the caterpillar gets in the fruit, nothing you can do. except for take the fruit out of the orchard. So as I mentioned about mating disruption, this is the pest here in this particular talk that I'll focus, use mating disruption for. It is what we consider to be our first line of defense, and you can put it out at bloom, leave it out all season. And there are label rates for these. So how many you're supposed to put per acre when you purchase these, and you put them in the upper third of the tree canopy. And then again, you just let it go all season. Ovicides, which just means they kill eggs, would be our second line of defense. So if mating disruption, if something actually gets through and is able to lay eggs, then we want to kill the eggs. And so there's sprays for this, other insecticide sprays, but one thing that we often recommend is actually just using oil. So this will prevent egg hatch by suffocating the eggs. And it's easier on natural enemies that might be around because it has a short residual, and it's not just going to sort of broad spectrum kill everything. And so we often recommend that in an IPM context because of that. And I just put delayed first cover strategy on there. I'm not going to go into degree days. This is just for your information about there are ways to calculate when you need to do sprays, and there are degree day calculators out there as well to explain some of this. This is more just, I leave this on the slides sort of for your information. And then if you don't get the eggs, then we use larvicides. And so that kills those newly hatched caterpillars before they come into the fruit. And so there's a bunch of conventional pesticides you can use here. There's also an organic option where there's a specific virus that just targets codling moth. So again, if you find as you start in your orchard that really all you have is codling moth, you can be very targeted at controlling codling moth. You can use mating disruption, you can use granulosis virus that is not going to affect anything else. But again, going to have very precise timing here. And again, I'll just mention there's degree days there as well. Now, throughout all of this, there are other, again, here's just a list of several different insecticides that are available. And again, these DDs, these degree days here are just the lower numbers are just earlier in the year. As the numbers get higher, that's later in the season. That you can spray. And these are all a bunch of conventional pesticides that are labeled. And again, you can look at the Midwest spray guide and sort of get some ideas as well from there. But forever and always be monitoring using those Delta traps. That first generation treatment is really essential for this pest. After that, it's not always as important. I talked about economic thresholds before. So here is our economic threshold for codling moth. So you got your 1 trap per 10 acres, and you're looking for 5 male moths per trap per week. And then that tells you that you need to be doing your control measures for this pest. The other control measure for this pest is sanitation. So this is another one of those pests that you want to get those fallen apples out of the orchard. If you see apples that are infested, you want to get those out as well. That'll help cut down your population in subsequent generations and subsequent years. So sanitation is really important for a lot of these pests that are internal feeders. So I'm going to go through a few more here. So woolly apple aphid is a pest that, has been worse in recent years, I think. And it's probably something that you will see once you start growing apples. And it is different than other aphids. You've probably seen other aphids before because it has, as its name suggests, it's covered in this sort of waxy woolly covering that can make it kind of protected from some sprays and from some natural enemies. It also doesn't necessarily eat the leaves. This thing is going to be eating your twigs, and it's going to be at wound sites. So often you'll look at a tree and you'll see this sort of woolly stuff at a wound site, and that is indication that you have woolly apple aphid. It's also, and it's really important for new apple growers, this is a serious pest of young apple trees. So this is something you really need to be looking out for when you're just starting out. They feed on tender bark. And if you get really large populations, they can end up in the roots, and control is very hard here. This is where the greatest damage can occur. And this is where your tree can die. They do have several generations per year as well. So mature trees don't tend to suffer as much, but these, newer trees definitely do. And so you can look for some yellowish foliage. And again, they can stunt and kill young trees. And then the picture on the left is just showing what the roots look like after an infestation. There is monitoring. So this doesn't actually have trapping for it. You have to monitor, you have to scout. And you can see the scouting there. If you're examining pruning scars on scaffold limbs. And one thing that I should note here is that you always have to look for live aphids. Just because you see the woolly stuff doesn't necessarily mean that you have live aphids. So when you're scouting, you have to make sure there's actually live animals, because sometimes natural enemies will come in and take down the whole population for you. So you want to make sure before you're spraying that you actually have live bugs there. And then the threshold here is that 10% of those pruning scars that you've looked at are infested with aphids, at which point you're going to need to take some control measure, which is likely going to be some sort of insecticide spray. And one way to make sure that you actually have live aphids is to basically blow on the colonies and make sure things are moving around. So growers used to use a lot of something called Lorsban, which is a pretty broad spectrum insecticide that has been banned for about a year now. And so there are a lot of things. This list is pretty much covers the things that are labeled for control of woolly apple aphid. And so it's not an easy thing to contend with. And so when you're starting out and you find that you have woolly apple aphid, it's probably good to contact your local extension folks and talk to them about control measures that might work in your area. Just because, as you can see from this large table I have, under efficacy, there's nothing that's listed as excellent. And a lot of it is listed as fair, unknown, even some as ineffective. So you can see that control of this particular pest is tricky for sure. Doesn't mean you won't be able to control it, but it will be something you'll have to contend with probably when you first start out. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about plum curculio, which is generally more of a peach pest, but we're seeing pretty high numbers of it lately, and so I wanted to include it here. Especially here in Illinois, we saw really kind of high numbers of it last year. So it is a plum, apple, peach pest. It's a beetle. It's actually a little weevil, it is another one of those internal feeders. So the beetle larvae lives inside the fruit, and you can see that in this peach picture I have there over on the left. And so these migrate into the orchards in the spring, which is when a lot of things come into the orchards, and they lay their eggs directly inside of the fruit. So unlike something like codling moth, you don't have the larvae on the outside of the fruit ever. The eggs are in the fruit immediately, so you're really just targeting with sprays just that adult when it's out active. The larvae hatch pretty fast. Conventional wisdom says that in the Midwest, we have 1 generation of these per year. It looks like, at least in my state, we may have 2, which will change some of our spray recommendations. So I think this highlights something else that I brought up with IPM at the very beginning when we're doing it science-based about the life cycle of pests. So we're learning more about this one in our area, and as things change, we have to change our IPM tactics. So this particular pest, I'm probably going to have to start recommending to growers that they're monitoring all year for it, as opposed to just monitoring in the early spring. On apples, the way that you know that you have this, if you're not using trapping, is these crescent-shaped scars on the fruit. And there's some surface feeding scars as well from the adults. The other way that you know that this is the problem that you have in your orchard is that it absolutely causes fruit to drop. So fruit will drop prematurely from the tree, and it will actually make basically any fruit that has a plum curculio in it will drop to the ground, so that that caterpillar or that beetle larvae can then go into the soil and pupate. I will say that within a peach orchard that that I'm aware of, they had fruit drop, basically all the fruit within like 5 to 10 days, it all drops. So it's fast. So much like the other pests I've talked about, we do have monitoring traps for these, and we do have a lure, although it's not a pheromone lure that you can use. And so we have the pyramid traps, which I talked about a little bit, and then we also have these trunk traps that you see here. And the trunk traps we put them both out early in the year, and this monitors for the adults, and the lure brings in the adults. So as they emerge from overwintering, they get into these traps. And so again, if this is a pest that you start to deal with, I would absolutely recommend that you're doing this monitoring as part of your IPM strategy. With this particular pest, it is a little bit harder for me to have found some thresholds for it. We recommend often that you do insecticide sprays at petal fall in apple, but that's without using trapping. That would be when you would spray, but I would recommend, using trapping. And it seems like the threshold, based on everything I can find, is about 1 adult per trap per week would institute a need for control. So that threshold is pretty low to have to go out there and spray for this particular pest. And of course, obviously these are all pictures of peaches, but you're going to see the same, sort of activity inside of an apple. So there are, again, this is a pest where you're really just spraying for adults. And so there are a bunch of them that are labeled, but you've got to have your timing right. So when you're using your trapping and you're getting your thresholds, you'll be able to spray at the right time to target those adults. Now you can see on this list for new growers, we have a bunch of different types of insecticides with different insecticide classes here. And so when you are doing rotating chemistries, you have to make sure that you're rotating within different chemical classes. So I've listed the pyrethroids here at the top, and you can see there's a bunch of those labeled for plum curculio. But if you were rotating chemistry for resistance management and you just rotated within the pyrethroids, you're not really rotating chemistry. So you want to use from different chemical classes. The other thing is I've got this little B box here on this slide, just to let you know that some of the things that are labeled are very, very toxic to bees. So that's, just something to keep in mind too with insecticide sprays. So the next pest I'm going to talk about is a pest of all kinds of things. Urban landscapes, all kinds of things, but it's also damaging to apples. It's also something you got to contend with. And the life stage that's destructive is the adult in this case, actually, which is quite different from a lot of the other things that we talk about. And so you're going to have those adults emerging in June, and you're going to get your damage in late June. And the grubs, the immature stage lives in the soil. So it can be a lawn pest, but as far as from the apple production side, you're not really worried about that quite as much. You're really worried about those adults that are in your orchard. And you can kind of see the picture there on the upper left. they tend to skeletonize leaves. They also feed on flowers. They feed on overripe or wounded fruit. And beetles attract more beetles to plants. And so they can be a huge problem. They, again, eat basically everything. So if you have them around, they're probably a pest on more than just your apples. There are commercially available Japanese beetle traps. Do not use those. They will make your problem worse. So I talk about trapping, and trapping is very important, obviously. But this is one example where you don't want to use the commercially available trap. So we often talk with control of this, that physical removal can be an actual control technique here. You can shake your plants early in the morning. You can shake them over a bucket of soapy water. Now, of course, if you have a large orchard, you're not doing that. This is for, a tree in your yard or a really small orchard, but it is something that can be part of your control. It's kind of a way of doing sanitation. But there are insecticides labeled for these guys. Again, I'm listing a bunch of things that are conventional here. And the bullet points translate to different chemical classes again. So if you're rotating, you need to be rotating between the chemical classes and not, within pyrethroids, for example. So the next pest that you may deal with is apple maggot. And you can see the adult fly in these pictures. But the destructive pest, again, is the immature stage. So the maggot is the destructive life stage here. Generally speaking, the adults are emerging around the 1st of July, and they will feed outside the orchard until they start laying their eggs under the skin of apples. Females can lay hundreds of eggs, and the larvae then feed inside the apples for 3 to 4 weeks. This pest, much like plum curculio, will cause your fruit to drop. So the apples will drop and the larvae will then pupate in the soil. So I've included some pictures of the damage you would expect to see if you have an apple maggot problem. So you can see the apples there on the bottom, they look pretty malformed. So if you're scouting in your orchard, you might see this sort of damage, and it might give you an idea that maybe this is the pest that, you've contended with if you're not actively monitoring for it. Each time a female fly lays an egg in the apple, a tiny dimple or sting is formed. And then the larval feeding is what causes the rot that you see in those other pictures. So sanitation is very important here, much like it is for plum curculio. Any pest that causes fruit to drop means you need to try to get as much of that fruit out of the orchard as you possibly can. Again, understanding that in large production, that can be really hard, but it still stands to reason that it is worth attempting. It is an important part of your IPM strategy to do your sanitation. And you can't just go lay them someplace else. They have to be destroyed and not on your property. But apple maggot does have a specific trap type. So that's something else. We have these red sticky balls, they're balls essentially, that you cover in a sticky material, and put a lure on, and it will show you if apple maggots are present or not. The threshold is really low here. It's one adult fly. You catch one and you need to start spraying. And so again, when we talk about trapping, oftentimes our trapping is very specific to the type of pest that you have. And so when you're beginning, it makes sense to start by monitoring. It might make sense to ask people around you who are already doing apple production what type of pests they contend with. I can basically guarantee you're probably going to contend with codling moth. Beyond that, some of these other things you may or may not have. And so it's definitely worth asking other people with more experience in your area what kind of things that they encounter on a yearly basis. And of course, like all these other things, there is a variety of insecticides that are labeled for control of these guys. And so I've listed several of them here. So as you get going, you'll get to know some of these things and which products, work and don't for your purposes. But just know that a lot of these pests have a variety of things that are in fact labeled for control of them. And then I just want to talk about this weird pest, the San Jose scale. It's really the only scale pest that we contend with in apple production here in the Midwest. And the reason I'm bringing this one up too is because we've had some larger issues with this recently as well. And so this is, again, it's a scale. And all of these pictures, the two on the bottom are the adult scales on branches, and I think the other one is actually on an apple. And then up top is the nymph before it actually gets covered in the wax. And then there's actually an adult male that is winged up in the upper left, but they're so small you'll probably never see those. And the adults emerge in the spring and mate. And so in the spring is when you get those crawlers. And that's where you probably want to target some of the control because they're not covered in that waxy covering yet. And so again, scouting is important if you have this pest. There aren't traps for this one necessarily. And so, you're wanting to have the scouting for this. They are a sucking insect. They inject a toxin that damages the tree. So they're a pest. Most of the other things I've talked about, are really a problem for the fruit. This thing is damaging the tree and the fruit. And if left unchecked, this pest can actually kill limbs or an entire tree in a few years. And you can see pictures down at the bottom too of the scales actually on the fruit. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I forgot. Yes, pheromone traps. There are pheromone traps for San Jose scale, and they should be put at bloom as well. And so once you start getting those tiny males, then that's when you can start thinking about treating. Again, like I said, the crawlers are absolutely the only stage that is susceptible to insecticides. And I've added some degree days here of when you should be spraying. Again, when you're using those sorts of models as well as you get going, those numbers will start to make more sense. And then I've listed some, things that are labeled for San Jose scale control. So I think just to finish up, sort of takeaways of all of this information, which I understand is a lot, is I guess the main thing I want everybody to keep in mind, of course, is that insect control is more than just insecticide sprays. And although I really only talked about, one thing that we use mating disruption for today, we have quite a few things that we can use that technique for. So that's an alternative control type. And then sanitation is very important. Sanitation is always very important for a lot of these pests. And when you're just starting out, it's good to start by implementing IPM techniques. So doing your monitoring and thresholds, if you don't have traps, scouting. And then of course, contact your local extension specialists when you encounter new pests. Ask questions. We're always here to help you out. And then this Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide will give you a lot more information about timings and a variety of things. And with that, I've got my email here and 2 phone numbers. And I will take absolutely any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Kacie. This was great. And like you said, a lot of information. So right now, before we go into questions, if we could launch the poll, I think our behind the scene extraordinaire Josie is put that out for you. So you have a couple of questions. The first one is, you find today's content helpful? How clear or easily understandable was Tuesday's webinar is the next one. And will you apply ideas that you learn or things that you learned? And then, are you likely to participate in more webinars? Are there enough resources? And how likely are you to take a course on beginner apple growing? So while you take a minute to answer the poll questions, I will let Kacie, maybe I'll just wait a minute and let people answer those questions. And so in the meantime, while you do that, so Kacie, what I did during your talk is I put a lot of links because I assume that people will have a hard time going back to everything and taking notes. So I put the Midwest Spray Guide already, and then I put links to every single one of the insects you talked about from different sources. So we have those links. And then so people know while they're filling out this poll questions is that we will post a recording of this webinar along with the other webinars we have, and you can find them at these two links here. So you will be able to the webinar there if you're interested in getting more information. So I'll start going through the first question. So we have a question that do delta traps have to be a certain color as added attractant? That was during codling moth, but I think that's worth discussing overall.
Yeah, so I don't think, at least, and Christelle, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Delta traps so far, you can get them in orange or white. And I think for most of the pests, because they're attracted to the lure, the color doesn't matter quite as much. So one thing that really matters with trapping, and this is especially true for codling moth, is that the shape of the trap is really what matters. So there's a bunch of different types of traps, and the delta trap shape is what is bringing things in, or at least making them more effective. So like for our stuff with codling moth, we used white and orange. And it didn't seem to matter. It was basically what we had around. And so I don't think the color for those matters so much. I think a lot of it matters for like how easily you're able to see the trap in the orchard when you have to go out and scout for them.
Yeah, and I would say, like, as you mentioned, that it depends on the insect. So for codling moth, yes, white, orange, that probably doesn't change much. But for other insects like apple maggot, it's really important that your trap is going to be red because they're looking for a red sphere that mimics an apple. So it will be very specific to the insect species on whether or not they're cueing on color. And it's mostly, often we see for insects, that's the contrast in color, the contrast of whatever that color is with the green background. So there's yellow sticky cards, and so it will change depending on the type of trap.
Yeah, but absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, Kacie. So another question, and that also was at the time of codling moth, but what baseline are we using for degree days? 50 is the question, Fahrenheit.
Yeah, so it sort of depends on how you're doing it, I guess. So sometimes they'll go with like a biofix, which means you had to have been monitoring your degree day number starts with the interception of the first pest, and then that starts it. Sometimes the degree days, the model can start with phenology as well. It sort of depends on the model you're using, I think.
Yeah, for codling moth, so it's kind of a question that's interesting because you're right, there's the biofix, and obviously that's going to vary depending on the species, and often it's a calendar base. For codling moth, it's the first 5 moths that you catch in apple. But for the baseline, so when we talk about baseline for using degree days, often it is indeed the 50 Fahrenheit, because anything happening below 50 for a lot of those moths nothing is going to happen in their development rate because it's too low of a temperature. So if the question was relating to the baseline for the calculation of degree days, that threshold, and I think, and you're right in what you're saying, Kacie, but it could be taken 2 days. That would be a base of 50 for codling moths. And for a lot of insects, it is actually of moths 50. But if we're talking about a baseline for starting calculating degree days, that's what Kacie was saying, it's going to be the biofix, and that can vary. But 50 is a good one for no development really happens below 50 Fahrenheit. So, okay. Another one is not a question, but I don't know how to say the name, but V. Laura is the first name that we have here. But mentioned that new at Cornell is good for degree day calculators. So I put the link to that. And if you're okay, I'll just say why I put the link.
Yes.
If you go to that new at Cornell, the NUA site, and you have the link there, what's nice is that it won't tell you the specifics of the degree days. What's nice is that it will use you have to first find where the weather station is, and they're available to anyone. So if you are in Wisconsin, for example, we have a lot of new weather stations. You can click to the nearest one to you based on a map, and then it will just use those models for the specific pests and tell you where you're at right now. But that's specific to where you are, because temperatures vary from site to site, from state to state, etc. But I just wanted to say, yes, that will be a good way of using those degree days and not doing the calculations.
Yeah, and that's a good one. You know, we have like a small degree day calculator here, like Illinois specific, but it doesn't do very many of the pests. And so I think, yeah, that Cornell one is the way to go.
Yeah. Okay, so another question from someone was hydrogen peroxide 3 to 5% for woolly apple aphid and or hotspots for root rot? And that's the question. So hydrogen peroxide.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I have not heard of that, although that isn't, to me, that it doesn't say that it's not something that we could do. I'm intrigued.
So I would say that hydrogen peroxide, I haven't heard of it being very effective, but I am not sure. So we would leave it at that as far as this comment here. I think that there's possibilities, but I'm not sure. And we would have to look further into that to answer that question. Okay, so another question was, when should I spray the overside oil for codling moth?
Yeah, so that one would be, did I have the degree day calculator for that one? Did I have the degree days in here? Let me just go back. Go way back.
Yeah, I do not recall when the time would be for the overside.
Yeah, because I've got all the degree days for specific.
Yeah. Okay. And something, for example, like Ryman, that's I think you were there.
So I've got 375 degree days under a delayed first cover strategy for the oil.
What I was going to say is that for Ryman, for example, and I don't know for the oil if it's the same, sometimes the label does say the number of degree days. So if you're at the stage where you're using degree days, it might say at so many degree days is when you would want to put that overside or larvicide. So that can also be helpful. But that's great that you have that, Kacie, here.
Yeah, and remember, another thing that I didn't say in this whole thing, but we always say, always read your label. Always read your insecticide label. Got to look at it. You got to read it. It's full of good information. And it's important to do that.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, another question. How can people with very small backyard orchards control these pests? Same pesticides, question mark?
Yeah, the one thing that you can't use is mating disruption. It won't work in a small backyard orchard, but there's a lot of things that you can, so not all of the same pesticides. I suppose there are certain things that are pesticides that are really more for commercial growers that you're basically going to have to buy so much of it that it wouldn't be worth it, but you can use all of these things. And so like, especially something like using oil and things like that would be great to use for home growers. Home growers also can use sanitation a lot easier because you have such a smaller area. So when I talked about like removing Japanese beetles, if you have a small backyard orchard, you would be able to manually remove those pests. But again, a lot of these insecticides you'd be able to use as well, even in a small production.
Okay, another one. I'm just trying to find the publication, and I don't have it, I'll keep looking, but is bagging fruit for homeowners, backyard owners. If you have one apple tree, you can bag the fruit, and there's a nice publication that UW-Madison Extension put together. And so I'll try to find that. There's a lot of information there that you can think about, and I'll try to find it, and I will go because question of time, we want to be mindful of everyone.
Yep.
The last question, we have had whole limbs of our pear tree die. San Jose scale, also to destroy infected fruit. Can you burn it? So pear tree die, I guess this question is, if you're not interested in pear, maybe we can skip. It's actually a question that is we're not going to be able to answer that. What I would recommend is, depending on what state you're at, go talk to your extension agent on that kind of a question, because it's going to take a lot more diagnostic than just saying San Jose scale.
Yep.
Absolutely. And then to destroy infected fruit, maybe.
Yep.
Maybe infected fruit, how to destroy it. Kacie, if you want to answer that, and then we'll be good to go.
Yeah. So, you want to get, a lot of times we say you can't compost infected fruit, and you want to get it all the way out of your orchard. Obviously you can't like start most of it on fire, but like really destroying it. You can put it, trying to think of some of the other ways. You just need to get it entirely out, break it apart, that sort of thing. Do you have any other recommendations, Christelle, on destroying?
Yeah. So I think that I'm thinking about other insects, but sorry. One way you could do is bury the fruit.
Oh yeah,
you do not want to compost. That's the one thing that a lot of people think, I'm going to compost it and it'll be fine. Composting is not good for getting rid of fruit. It's a warm, cozy place for insects to continue develop and then attract more insects to lay eggs in those fruit. So you do not want to compost, but there's the possibility. I know for spotted wing Drosophila, for example, we recommend that you could potentially bury the fruit. And then another one would be to solarize the fruit. So I would suspect it would be the same here for apple. If you don't have a ton of apple, that's the thing. You could put plastic over it, really secure the plastic around in a sunny area, and that will cook the fruit and the insects that are inside those fruit. But you're right, removing it from the fruit if you're doing sanitation is a good idea.
Yeah, and it can be really hard when you have a large production to get all that fruit out of there, and you get as much as you can.
And I'm just gonna somebody asked me for my contact information, so here it is. But besides that, I think thank you so much, Kacie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Kacie, for a fantastic talk. Again, the recording is at the links that I just put, and maybe I'll put them again here, and you can see that at a later time. It will be posted today, so anytime after that, and it will stay there. And then again, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming.